Click. All right. So once again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us. My name is Mushiri Nyaga from the Local Development Research Institute on behalf of the Data for Development Network. Welcome, or as we say in East Africa, Karibu. This is the second session of our second edition of Roundtables. This year, we had a similar series of roundtable discussions earlier in the year. And this is our second series. So today is the second session on agriculture. We'll be joined by old friends and we'll have a conversation on what has changed with the open data landscape in agriculture since 2018. Just to give you that 1 minute background, at that time in 2018, the Open Data for Development Network, with support from the International Development Research Center, published a report on the state of open data. That was 4 years ago. So this state of open data report is now being updated, being refreshed. And this series of conversations that we've been having this year through these roundtables are an effort to hear from you and to bring experts around the table to have those conversations and to see what has changed, what has progressed, where have we walked back over the last few years in relation to open data in the sector. So I will stop there and not take up too much more of the chair's time. Allow me to introduce Martin Parr from CABI. He will introduce his panel and tell you a little bit about himself and the work that CABI does, and we'll get this conversation on open data in agriculture started. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you very much, Machiri. It's great to see you after a number of years. Hope to bump into you in Nairobi sometime soon. So I'll introduce the panel in a couple of minutes, but before that, I just wanted to give some personal reflections before we start the meeting. So I'll be chairing the meeting and hopefully won't be saying too much. It'll be mainly our panelists that will be saying stuff, but I thought I'd start off with some reflections before we started proper. So as you say, it's 3 years since the State of Open Data publication was produced, and I was involved in that chapter on agriculture. I was co-author on that chapter. The lead authors of that paper are currently not available today, and I was hoping especially that Ruthie Musker would be able to be here and involved in the session, but she's not, unfortunately. She would probably have been a more appropriate chair for this event, but nonetheless, you have me. But some of the others, some of the other key people that really informed our thinking at the time and on that original piece are here today to reflect on how far we might have come since we originally published that paper. So the data policy and practice team that I lead at CABI, some of which I see, thank you folks, on this call today, has also produced or is in the process of publishing a short blog that gives our own take on the progress and how the debate might have shifted since that time 3 years ago. And I hope that will be available shortly on the State of Open Data website. So I think some of those issues that we hope to discuss today will be covered in that blog. But what do I think some of the headlines here that I think we want to unpack in our discussions today? Well, we could look at this from various angles, but I think we've agreed that the focus will be on data sharing, specifically as we see progress in the science and international development contexts. But I'm hoping that many of the insights that we're going to cover have broader applicability. Data and useful evidence are still often not accessible to those that most need it in agriculture. Poor data management and sharing continues to result in duplication of effort, waste of resources, and a reduced return on investment. And crucially, incentives to modify practice in science, especially around data sharing, are not currently strong enough to change this. Agricultural research funded by governments and donors very often fails to get used and built on beyond the lifetime of funded projects because there's not enough thought given to what happens when the project ends. Interventions that rely on the modeling of data can be built on incomplete or inaccurate evidence as a result, and so fail to live up to expectations. Decision support tools can't be made or updated and sustained because data access is restricted. Digital and data policy is often not informed by appropriate consultation and evidence. So these problems have in the past 10 years led to a series of initiatives: the open access and open science movements, and indeed the open data movement, driven in that case specifically by a more general desire for greater transparency in the workings of science in institutions and in governments. More recently, we've had the FAIR data principles as a guiding star to help us. FAIR data is data which is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. As a framework, it's gained wide acceptance, especially within the EU. Or within these frameworks, while useful, they're still imperfect. Some data shouldn't be open, but should still be findable and usable by those who have legitimate need. Many of the definitions of FAIR that are out there are very technical, which can set people up to fail when many start off from a place where basic data management is poor. What is still too often missing is designing digital with and for beneficiaries. That is, to design for the user, as the principles for digital development put it. How often do we ask those that we work with, what data sharing can usefully mean for them? How often do we ask people, what does data sharing look like for you that is useful for you? We might contend that really good data governance isn't just something that comes from the top down. It needs to be informed by understanding of social norms, of economics, institutions, and of policies, as well as the technology options available to us. And that means governance co-created with the very people that can benefit from better data sharing. It's these themes that I want us to explore today, especially around this theme of how we understand user need and foster collaboration around data. How we incentivize people to make a change and to make shared and open data more normal, more usual. What are the appropriate frameworks to work with in this space? Is it open? Is it fair? Or is it something else? So, as we start our panel session, I'm going to ask the panel each in turn to introduce themselves briefly. So as I see you on my screen here, maybe we can start off with Medha Davari.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me well enough. My name is Medha Davari, and I am Chief Data Officer for the for CGIAR's Excellence in Agronomy Initiative. I am a system agronomist by training and have done a lot of work in the open data, fair data space, including envisioning and building tools and sort of the pathway towards deriving some insight from these tools. And much of that work has been done through CGIAR's platform for big data and agriculture, and we're kind of taking all of that work forward through the Excellence in Agronomy Initiative, where it's actually getting much more widely tested and basically put to the fire and improved. So let me stop there and hand over back to Martin, I guess.
Thanks. Next on my screen, I have Sander Janssen. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Martin. My name is Sander Janssen. I work at Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands, where I lead a group called Informatics, which is basically remote sensing, geoinformation, data services for a lot of applications in agriculture and environment. I've been working in the open data space for the past 5, 6, 7 years. And then we did a lot of practical projects trying to make data open, just as Medha, and trying to collect data from different sources. So, for example, we built the Global Yield Gap Atlas, which is a open data source on agricultural productivity, where we really thought like, how can we use, bring this data to a more mature level. Another one is the AgroStack initiative that we are doing together with Vito in Belgium, where we are working to bring field trials in a better usable way, let's say. And that's sort of my personal passion, to make things usable for some end user. Yeah, and I will stop before I talk too much. So back to you, Martin.
Thank you. And our final panelist today, Teklu, if you could introduce yourself.
Thank you, and good afternoon to all. I hope you are hearing me. My name is Teklu Kosa from Ethiopia. I'm working for GIZ as a project manager, a project supporting soil intervention in Ethiopia, jointly funded by the Gates Foundation and BMZ, German International Development. One of the objectives of this project is to support the national researchers and development actors, and as well as their partners, to generate evidence-based ag advisories, particularly focusing on soil and agronomy. And basically, I am soil scientist and agronomist by training, and I've been working for national and international research. Before I joined GIZ, I was working for the International Water Management Institute, where I was working as water manager, although I'm no water scientist. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teklu. And before we get on to the kind of questions in some detail, I also want to introduce you to Melissa. Melissa, can you just say hello?
Hello.
Hi. So Melissa acts today to kind of prompt us and to keep us on time and to facilitate some questions from the audience. If you start to ask so many questions that we can't keep on top of them, Melissa will be there to field those questions and to kind of put them back to us. So thank you, Melissa, for fulfilling that role today. So we're going to start off with a question, a brief question for all of the panelists, and I'm going to ask you to respond each in turn, but also I'm going to ask it for all of the participants that are here on the call today. And the question that I want you to all think about, and if the people on the call could maybe put in their response in the chat field, is: has the promise of open data been met as we might have expected to have when we were kind of reflecting on it 3 years ago? So has open data, the promise of open data, been met as we might have expected it to have been when we were looking at this 3 years ago? And if not, what, if anything, do you think has got in the way of progress? So panelists, does anybody want to dive in first on that? Teklu, I see you've come off mute. That's me telling you that you want to take it first.
Yeah, sure. Here in Ethiopia, about 4 to 5 years ago, we have been discussing about the open data among few groups of scientists, researchers, and so on. And we thought that was kind of no-go area, and people did not like at all to hear about open, because open, in a sense, people looked about understood about the final completely open scenarios, regardless of the type of data. So in our case, I think we stepped back and started to talk about the fair data. And in terms of the fair data, also, because we started, I think, with open data, which kind of shock for many people. It took us a long way until we got most people on track as far as the FAIR data application was concerned. So I think here in Ethiopia, maybe I don't know, maybe it could be the case in other places. We have really progressed a lot, and we are somewhere within the open data spectrum, but still we really don't talk about open data. Rather, we talk about the FAIR data, and we are trying to verify our data. And it has not been a topic for many people 3 to 4 years ago, but now I think individuals, institutions are talking about it, and there are a lot of forums, discussions about this, starting also from the policymakers themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Teklu. So I think in summary, you're saying, you know, from where you started to look at this 5 years ago, it very soon became a bit of a barrier. The kind of all or nothing nature of framing this as open or not was a bit of a barrier. Sander, Meda, who wants to go first?
I can take a shot if that's okay with Sander. Okay. So I'm going to be a little bit perhaps provocative here. We started out talking about open data, as you're well aware, Martin, at CGIAR, and that's especially important given that CGIAR has a public goods mandate that's quite strong. It's absolutely critical that data needs to be interoperable and reusable, and that became very clear to us soon into the pushing of the open data. Because we were seeing things that were, I hate to admit it, but they were, and this was about 6 years ago now, so it's been a while, but we were seeing screenshots of PDFs, data tables put up in repositories and under the guise of being open. And so obviously, it became very clear that we needed to nuance this. And so when FAIR data came along, it absolutely made sense. But my concern, what we're talking about now, I guess, is open and fair. We stress at CGIAR open and fair, even though we recognize that when data is fully findable, fully accessible, if you're ticking off oops, sorry, if you're ticking off, I'm getting an echo. Okay. I'll try again. So when things are completely fair and completely accessible, they're open. But what we find is a little bit under the guise of fair, that the emphasis on actually making our data available more widely has kind of been diluted a little bit, and so that's a bit of my concern. That we're when we talk just about fair, it seems to be a little bit of a loophole, perhaps. And what we need to focus on at CGIAR particularly is that data is open to the fullest extent possible. I mean, keeping in mind the research ethics issues that I'm sure we'll be commenting on as we go forward in this conversation. But yeah, that would be my 2 cents, I guess, in terms of have we reached the promise? I think it's a mixed bag. I would say that yes, we've progressed for sure. But we've also backslid a little bit as people start to worry about this. The other factor, of course, in the backsliding, or what I call the progress not the dreams not quite being met, are of course legitimate concerns on that have to do with national level concerns around data, around being able to action on data, being able to, those are completely, absolutely legitimate. So the question is, how do we balance all of this? How do we make sure that the agricultural sector progresses in the same way that the biomedical sector has, using open data as a very strong basis for transforming the sector, really? How do we do that and still keep in mind all of these different sensitivities that we need to balance? So I'm throwing back the question, I guess.
That's good. How about that specific question about promise? Were we too idealistic 3 years ago?
You want me to come back on that one? I'm not sure if we were too idealistic. I think I still stand by my statement that in order to really transform the agricultural sector, we need to have a strong knowledge base, a strong base of data that's really actionable. I mean, the kinds of challenges we face today, just look at the current crisis, the fertilizer crisis, the food crisis. Those are things that policymakers need actionable data quickly and at hand to make the right decisions. I think what we're not asking ourselves at any level, whether it's organizational level or even national level, is why is it that we need to keep data, to close data? Why is it that open data cannot be the default? What is the problem? In some cases it's legitimate, but I think in many cases it's kind of a blanket sort of security concerns or some sort of, I would argue that we're not critical enough, and therefore in asking the questions on, why is it that data cannot be open? And if that might lead us to then ask what kinds of data should not be open. I don't think that the conversation has been nuanced enough. In short. So let me stop there, Martin, because I saw Sander kind of nodding and having some sort of reaction. Let me go over to Sander.
Thanks, Sander.
Yeah, that's the same. I share the same thinking as Meta there. I think I think we haven't been too idealistic. Maybe we're not idealistic enough in the past years. We were idealistic initially, and then we got bogged down somehow in detail. So, yeah, I would agree with that we need to stay idealistic, because indeed we are not there yet. And I think, we speak a lot about what the public sector has been doing, and for the public sector, it's been, in some cases, there are things clear front-runner countries will do a lot, they will make a lot of data, but there's also a lot of diversity across countries. So that's one. But then the private sector is largely missing in this conversation, and I think that's not very encouraging. We could, with all the big crises we have with food and climate, we need a lot more to help farmers, but the farmers don't also have the data. So yeah, we need to really, and we need then open data to make that happen to a large extent, because we lack the basic layers to do the analytics. So that's that's a bit my personal view. If you talk about obstacles, I think it was nice that both Meta and TechLoo talked about how FAIR interacted with open. To me, when I saw FAIR come, I thought it makes it more complicated in a way, because there's so many levels there, and so it's also a quite technocratic approach, while the open was more like a policy paradigm, like this is what we really want to do, and it should be accessible for all, and that's it's sort of intuitive to me. That was intuitive. The FAIR made it a lot more vague, like what are we really after. But I was happy to hear TechLoo's response that it helped him in Ethiopia to gradually move forward there. So yeah, I think we may need to go back to this initial thought, like what also Meta was saying, like what do we need to get more data open, and what are the barriers there, and are these really truly barriers, or are these just people trying to avoid doing the work? Or there's also a lot of power play. I noticed from being myself from a scientific institution, where people would like to sit on their data to publish or to take most benefit out of it for themselves, or it's like a savings account. I sometimes think like you save your data there for when it's really dire, then you can fall back on this data and do some more analysis. So yeah, I think we need to be maybe a bit more self-critical there, and really stay pushing for this open paradigm over FAIR in a way.
Good. No, that's really useful to see that I think it reflects a lot of what I've heard from people is that open clearly wasn't enough on its own, because of its emphasis essentially on on IP. You know, making something open really meant making sure that the IP was appropriate and that the material was copyrighted appropriate and putting it out there. But it clearly needed to be more than that. And also that we see some challenges with FAIR because it is a very technical definition. And I know that our team has spent a little bit of time on that. And in fact, we work with some of the people that Tekla has been working with in Ethiopia to kind of define what FAIR might mean for individuals in different contexts. There's a very technical definition, but there's also a kind of a very natural language definition to FAIR as well. And I'm hoping that some of that might come up in the questions as we go through the session today. So I don't think we've had much from the floor yet, Melissa. I see an observation from Tom Challoner about some of the challenges, unearthed challenges when data is open, but maybe we can come back to that later. So what I think we'll do is we'll press on into the next round of questions. And in fact, this kind of starts to unpack some of the issues around FAIR itself. I think, you know, it's been said that some of the language around FAIR is not results focused enough. So that we say that data has to be findable rather than found. And found, to say that something is found in the form of data implies that somebody's actually been looking for something and that they found something useful. Similarly, reusable might be better phrased as reused, because reused speaks to actual use rather than the theoretical language of reusable. Sander, I know in a recent paper that you produced, you referred to a data quality model, and you said that in that paper that 5-star quality data is that which has been used. So with that in mind, and maybe we might start with Sander, what's the best evidence that you've seen that data has been found, accessed, interoperated, and reused? What evidence do you have from your experience and from your work that making data more open or more fair represents, crucially, a good investment in time and resources, because it takes both? So I think about 5 minutes, Sander, if you want to kind of get your take on that. Did you manage to get all of that?
Yeah, I managed to get it, Martin.
Right.
It's a big question, so I
If you take slightly longer, that's okay. I think.
No, I don't need. I think in my experience, maybe we have battled with this question. How do we get people to really use data? I think that's the big thing here. And then, in our experience, we tend to look at not beyond a single data point and data source. So we often think, you know, it's not one data source that makes a great result from an analytical point of view, but you need more to combine more data sources, and then you get and then you can do things with that. So what we always stress is that if these individual data sources or data points are not available or open, you cannot basically do a lot on the aggregate level. So we've done a lot of that around, I mentioned before, the yield gap atlas, where this is really based around getting data on soil, water, climate, and agricultural statistics together, and then combining that and building out of that an open data point as a yield gap estimate. So it's, you know, of course, all these steps need data, and if one of the steps is missing, and we saw a lot of differences between countries there. Some countries we could do quite specific analysis, in other countries we couldn't do a lot. Then the analysis becomes essentially weaker. A lot of people use this yield gap data. So when we started about this in 2010, it was a very new concept, and you know, it's some colleagues here at my institute who took that together. But now this whole idea of yield gap is a sort of a basic point, a lot of agronomic analysis. So it's became really big, partly by having a new concept, but also by being able to operationalize it with open data sources. So these two need to come together, and then you can make a big impact. A lot of people, I think that's a very good story of how people use it. And I mean, I was 2 weeks ago visiting a farmer in the north of the Netherlands, really on a farm, and they were growing a lot of potatoes, and they also started talking about yield gap. And I thought that was my proof of evidence that if it reached the farmers thinking, then we are making a step here. To me, then this whole thing, I mean, we didn't, about going back to this distinction between open and fair, that's where I saw fair not helping, because we made an aggregate product out of the data which is being reused. And but then, is this fair or not? We could have a large debate, and probably, you know, we need a lot of beers to resolve this question, and we might never finish when we get to this point of maturity that we can say, okay, now we are done. We have fair data, and it's fine. You know, we don't need to do anything anymore about this. And I think that's with a lot of the vagueness, which is also frustrating for the people who produce the data, because you never know, when am I really finished with this stuff? And that's why I think the open. So by us having this role of data curator, we call it, and that's also in the paper, then by curating, reviewing, we get a lot more value out of the data from the point of looking at it from the user point of view. So what would the user really like to get out of it, instead of what do I, as a data producer, think should be in it? I think that's a really fundamental change in how you view it, but that's not kept. I think your distinction being found and reused gets it, but I think that's where fair gets a little bit drawn too much in the technical details, instead of the, you know, this should be the way forward. So I hope I gave a bit of an answer to your question there. I don't know if I took 5 minutes, but that's the direction.
Thank you. Given the fact that the issues of yield gap are also, I know, probably also in the space of Meda's experience. I don't know whether you, before I ask you that question, in terms of, you know, your kind of best evidence that you've found that data has been, you know, been made fair, and you know, that open and fair have kind of made a difference. Do you have any reflections on Sander's observations around the importance of sharing information on yield gap, and indeed any sensitivities there might be around that?
Well, I want to reinforce what Sander said, you know, because it's almost exactly word to word what I was going to say to this. Now we're not talking about individual data sets. We're talking about the need to create aggregations, sometimes large aggregations of data to be able to action on. And that's, you know, even more important now in the last few years, with the importance of data science techniques, new and emerging data science techniques, machine learning, AI, all of those kinds of approaches are very much applicable and can advance our sector very quickly and exponentially, I would say, forward. But of course it needs data. And so what I want to actually share my screen here, because I have an example that is best or better illustrated perhaps. And you should be able to see my screen here. I will put it in presentation mode. And what I want to show is a schematic that looks like this. Let me move this out of the way. Right. So here's an example of actual, not so much fair data to really answer a real question, but at least findable and accessible, and how far, you know, we went with it and what it led to. So this is an example that you know, is based around a very key question, which is, you know, where in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is fertilizer use actually profitable in maize? And this is for maize. This work was published in last year's Nature Food, in I think the October issue of Nature Food. It was done by Camila Bonilla, who was at CGIAR but is now at Wageningen, in fact. Jordan Chamberlain, who was at FAO and is now back at CGIAR, and Robert Heymans, who continues to be at UC Davis. So that was the team that did this research. But the key is that they went to CGIAR's Guardian platform. I can put the link in the chat in a minute. But what Guardian does is to look across all of CGIAR's data repositories, as well as some World Bank data, USDA data, the Indian government's data, CIRAD in France, you know, a number of different data sources, to try and provide access to data with the licenses, obviously, so that people can find data in one, from one sort of source, and find also the publications that are relevant to that data in most cases. In any case, they found data when they started out to ask this question. They found fertilizer response data. This is getting back to Sanders yield gap data a little bit, because to compute yield gaps, you need fertilizer response data. They were able to find this data for over 760 locations in Africa. This amounted to over, certainly well over 100 data sets. I think it was close to 120 data sets. And from, so that data was findable and accessible. Was it interoperable? No, it wasn't. They actually developed a workflow to take each data set and make it interoperable so that they could then aggregate the data. And this workflow also, it was an R-based workflow. They were able to create an aggregation of those data sets, and then apply their machine learning models, and combine, price data, weather data, soil data, to compute the local profitability of fertilizer use. And they developed these response curves. They developed the spatial, they did some spatial analysis as well, and presented that to be able to then answer that question: is fertilizer use, or where is fertilizer use profitable? And they did it by country, and for one crop in this instance, but it led to a very promising approach that we're now trying to leverage on further at CGIAR, and particularly through the Excellence in Agronomy initiative. I should mention that all of this stuff is open. It's available for people to use. These authors also published the Dataverse that they created out of that aggregated data. That's where I see value. This kind of stuff is where I see the value derivation. It's a bit of a pseudo example, I realized, because the data wasn't fully fair, but it was certainly findable and accessible. And through the workflow, now we have a means to make that data interoperable, and the licensing, along with the other factors, determines the ability to reuse that data. So it's a very concrete example of fair data. Let me stop sharing here and come back to you folks. But let me stop here, because I think the question was, are there concrete examples? And that is an absolutely concrete example that we're trying to now have more such examples through the work we do in Excellence in Agronomy. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Meda. So Teklu, if I could bring you in now and ask for your experience working in probably quite different contexts, where the impetus, as you've said, to full openness is not quite there in certainly some of the government and policy environments that you're in. All the more reason to have good examples of where data sharing has made a real difference, and where you can show people the value of at least sharing data with a select number of people, even if it's not made fully open. Can you talk to us about some of the best evidence that you've seen where the value of making data more fair and or open has been seen?
Yes. As I said earlier, data sharing itself between small groups was a very sensitive issue in Ethiopia. Already during the last 15 years, we have been discussing in small groups and in society, especially soil science society, agronomy society, if we could share our data. And for that, the first approach we have followed was to try to push the formal system. I mean, the government, the research institute, the Ministry of Agriculture, and so on, to enable a centralized data repository and sharing system. But that was very difficult, because first the level of understanding, the level of consciousness about the power of having large data, so to say, big data, in decision making was not that understood in levels. So, but during the last 5 years, probably, we started to discuss among small groups if we could start by in small groups and make data accessible, share among ourselves, and show the potential to the other people. And a small group was formed, I think, in 2018, about 20 to 30 people initially. And these people, they call themselves the Coalition of the Willing because they are willing to share their data only within the group. But they took also an assignment to promote the idea of data sharing by showing some evidences. So they started to create some sort of terms of reference for themselves. They created their own task force, which led the work of the group. And so the group initially embarked on assessment of what data is available, basically, because we are talking about data sharing, but we don't know how much data, what sort of data, and the nature, and so on, and also what the individual data owners, whether it is an institute or individual, what they think about making their data available for others. So we have conducted a sort of the data ecosystem mapping, which also includes the conditions for the data owners under which they could share or make their data available to others. So we had documented that. And we found about over 40% of the data owners were willing to share the data. And that was very encouraging for us, although it is much less than the 50%. So then we started to go back to these people, but they have even this over 40% who were willing to share. They were interested to have some kind of guideline, some kind of guarantee how the data would be used, and also how they would be acknowledged and so on. So they have some sort of criteria. So instead of, in order to get those data in place, together, the CAO, the Coalition of the Willing, had to create some sort of internal guideline, data sharing and access guideline. They have developed that, and using that data sharing and access guideline, they went back to the individuals and the institute. And after we had this guideline, basically more people than initially shown interest to share have shared their data. In fact, some of those who initially were shown interest had also changed their mind, but I think up to maybe 50% of the so-called data owners have shared their data. During this process, we have managed to mobilize up to 40,000 agronomy crop response to fertilizer data and about 20,000 soil profile data, and that was really huge. And inspired by this, the government has also shown interest to have an official kind of data sharing policy and guideline, of course, supported by the Coalition of the Willing and other partners. And they have developed a policy, which in fact has taken a long time until it was approved as a directive, because the process of policy formulation takes a different step if we have a policy or a directive. So we wanted to demonstrate this and embark on a bigger policy. So we settled for the directive. So now at the Ministry of Agriculture, we have Soil and Agronomy Data Sharing Directive. And to implement the directive, we have different data portals, basically one for soil survey, and another one for agronomy, which is now gradually operational. But also to get the interest of the scientists, the data owners, we have done a lot of exercises, including capacity building, including an advanced data analysis, and also machine learning approach. And as a product of this, one of the, interesting presentation slides Meda has shown, looks like what we also here trying to achieve for Ethiopia. I'm sure Meda should be aware because the SIAT group is working on this with other partners, of course, with our support. And they have developed and preliminary result was published in Experimental Agriculture, also on crop response based on machine learning and data mining approach. And parallel to that, they have also used this machine learning approach on this legacy data to develop the soil map of Ethiopia. It is the first of its kind. Ethiopia did not have its own digital and high resolution soil map. And that is also under publication. I think a lot of people, it has maybe thousands of downloads before its publication because it was open for comment by community. So I think now we have also developed different guidelines. I mean, the coalition of the willing, because the data that has come from different sources was really of different sources. I mean, it was not standardized. So it was not reusable. It was not interoperable. So a lot of work has been done to clear that and harmonize. But to avoid that in the future, they have developed about 6 data standardization guidelines, which is being streamlined now, mainstreamed by the research institute, and a lot of work is going around that. And as I said earlier, we are still struggling to have all people on board, but I think we have a kind of momentum has been created. And compared to 3-4 years ago, I think we are good. But if you give me 1 minute, I think, Martin,
to comment on this. What I might do is, if it's okay, because I think there's a lot in there, and I'd like to kind of focus on a specific aspect of that, if we have the time. You know, you've described how you created this coalition of the willing, a kind of a community of practice to kind of encourage people to share data kind of in that group. You set up a group of people, you inventorized some data assets, you got them to kind of say what's out there. You wrote some rules of engagement around how these people might interact, kind of what, you know, I think built around some of the FAIR guidelines kind of underpinning that. And then out of the back of it, you developed some technical guidelines, and you've also got that policy kind of guidelines and policy directive in space to encourage data sharing, because that was coming from the top. So you're encouraging people to share data more. They're kind of saying, well, we've done it, so maybe you might do it as well. You've got to the point where you've got a de facto data sharing policy for the country. What are the big things do you think that has made a difference there? How did you take the dial from a situation where data sharing was frankly very rarely done, and in some cases actively feared, to one where the intention was at least to make it much more of a norm? How did you get from one to the other? It wasn't just a series of steps. What were the big things that you needed to put in place?
I think it is not only one thing, I think. Important, I think, is a kind of, it's a lot of exercises that meant to create trust. Because people are always suspicious about what would be done with the data once they share. And we have practiced with the small data that came initially, and we have encouraged people to, we have also conducted a lot of capacity building in this. And through this capacity building, they have already learned that if you have larger data, you know, research in Ethiopia, I mean, particularly in agronomy and the soil, was started over 60 years ago. But we don't have any national recommendation, be it for fertilizer or other agronomic practices. We don't have really, I mean, the scientists don't have confidence because they conduct research in all small isolated areas. But when we bring this data together, we have demonstrated that you can do it if you pull your data together. So the power of that was demonstrated in different training, workshops, and also publications, and engaging everybody into the practice. For example, in this soil map I was talking about, the data came from maybe 40, 60 institutes, but as far as we knew, in the analysis, in the cleaning of the data, harmonization of the data, everybody was involved, and the publication has about 50 co-authors. So everybody feels that he or she is in. And whenever we have organized a kind of workshop, training, and so on, and we use those data that are already in our hand, we also invited those who did not give the data, and they say, oh, we have data, there data out there. That institute has data. Our data is not included here, so we have to share. So it was kind of iterative process. I mean, you need to have a continuous engagement with people and get the trust of all the data on it. But what I wanted to comment earlier, I mean, was related this FAIR data. You know, this FAIR is, I think, that is coined from the perspective of the data user, not from the perspective of the data creator or data generator. It is, you know, the data should be findable. Findable to who? To somebody who wants to use the data. It should be reusable. Who will use the data user, and so on. Where is the data creator in FAIR? Why should they make their data fair? I mean, the data owner, the data creator, maybe you could think in terms of incentives, but the FAIR doesn't say anything about that. So how can we ensure that people feel they are acknowledged, they are benefiting from sharing their data? Also for organizations, it could be for organization, it could be from individuals. So when you say we are not, okay, we are trying to make data, we are looking for fair data. Why? Because we want to use it. Now, yeah, I just want you to comment.
I am going to move you on because some really valuable insights there around the importance of building relationships and building trust, and the importance of you know, giving people the ability to access the data, training, and then that idea of kind of engaging everybody, and not just engaging people once, but that being a kind of a continuous engagement process. And then kind of you left us with some interesting thoughts about FAIR, and maybe that the incentives to FAIR, there may be a kind of an asymmetry in some of those incentives sometimes, that some people may benefit more than the people who generate the data. And I think that's an interesting concept. I'm going to now pivot to Meda, if that's okay. And maybe she might be able to even pick up on some of those strands, especially around incentives, because I know that you're very interested in kind of incentives to share, and how those may be different between the individual and the institution, and between the data generator and the data user. But I think I specifically wanted to, if it's okay for you, to give some of your experiences around learning from the CGIAR platform for big data, which was for a number of years a real flagship program to promote better data management, to promote the use and reuse of data within the CGIAR itself, kind of as an institution, and indeed with your kind of key stakeholders and partners. So as you now start to work on a new phase of initiatives, and I'm thinking especially of the Excellence in Agronomy program that you're now a big part of on the data side, Madha, I'm interested to know what learning you're taking out of the CGIAR platform for big data, that you're taking out of that and using in the new program. You know, give us the good stuff, stuff that you think has worked really well, and also maybe, you know, some of the real kind of lessons learned as well.
Okay, thanks, Martin. And I will come back to some of the things that Tekli said, probably to, again, be a little bit provocative. but let me start with, you know, some of the things that we did stand up during the big data platform came from a recognition that, yes, we do need to be talking about open and fair. You know, we do need I think somebody mentioned, I think it was you perhaps, the need for the policy environment. I mean, you need to incentivize this stuff somehow. You need to have, you know, the build towards that culture change. And a big part of that is first putting in place a strong governance mechanism, which tends to be the weak point. And for us at CGIAR, it continues to be a bit of a weak point. We're still working on that, but we do have a strong policy in place, an open and fair data assets policy. And we specifically use the term open and fair. You know, we need to have some you know, strong governance structure in place to make sure there's the awareness building, the mechanism for strong capacity and concerted, consistent capacity building through it, development of standards and such. So the actual work that needs to go into making things open and fair, you know, how do we do that? I will say, though, again, that the technical piece is much easier than the cultural piece. Always, it's you know, we need to work much harder on changing culture, and we lag very much behind in the agricultural space compared to, say, the biomedical space, also to some degree the ecological space, I would say. And you know, for some reason, there's always this big fear in agriculture that the sky is going to fall down on my head if I share my data, to really make it open, that somebody's going to scoop me. You know, it's really difficult to scoop somebody. I mean, it's very difficult to take a data set that's not yours and use it effectively. So I will say that I think that is somewhat of an unfounded, you know, issue. But in terms of governance, I think there's also a strong need for assessing, you know, are we compliant with our own policies? It's very easy to sort of to find loopholes and slip through them. So the compliance is a big piece of that as well. In terms of incentivization, I think one of the key things is, all right, so as a researcher, you know, and I can wear my researcher hat and say, okay, you're telling me to do something differently. You're telling me that my data has to be fair. So tell me how to do it. You know, what, you know, you can't just leave me with that and give me these fair principles. How do I actually apply them? And so what we've done at CGIAR, this is the learnings, one of the learnings that we've put in place really through the big data platform, continuing on to the Excellence in Agronomy initiative and broader even, is, you know, building the tools and making those tools available to get to fair data. I've already shared the link to Guardian, which you know, kind of is an effort to create a database, or not a database, but a way to search across multiple different repositories, data repositories at CGIAR and beyond, that allows people to find and access, in many cases, data. And this is now up to about 20-some thousand data sets in Guardian, 200,000 publications or so. But beyond that, there's a lot more in the toolkit that you can find at Guardian that allows you to use tools that collect data that's born fair. So that's making your life easier as a researcher to get towards that fair data anyway, and make it open, ideally, as part of your mandate. There are also tools to take historical high-value data and make them fair that we've developed. And then there's all sorts of other stuff, okay, so you have the fair data, now how can you action on that? And an open sort of high compute storage data architecture, collaborative platform actually, that allows people to analyze the data and to use our pipelines to derive value from the data is something that we also have stood up. All of this stuff is available on Guardian. But the point here is the incentivization piece in terms of making it easier for people to do this. That's a key part of it. And the other part of it is, I think Teklu mentioned data sharing guidelines and templates. We've got a lot of that in place. Getting people to apply it, and particularly with private sector. I think Sandra mentioned, the kind of the weakness there is that it's difficult to get agreements with private sector. We can have the guidelines and templates in place to make it easier for scientists to have something off the shelf. But then getting buy-in to that is not that easy always. That remains a challenge, I would say, something difficult that we're still grappling with at CGIAR, and I'm sure at other institutions as well. One key thing is funders, what the role that funders play in this whole ecosystem. I think some funders have policies now for grantees to make their data open and encourage data to be fair. But they don't put teeth behind them, and this is something that's really lacking and could benefit the whole sector. I mean, I keep talking about the biomedical sector, but things in the biomedical sector didn't get going until NSF and NIH in the US mandated that they withheld some 20% of the funding for their grantees, saying that you'll only get that funding if you make your data open. And again, I will say that this did not result in much scooping. This hasn't been in place since the mid-1980s and has led to a transformation of the biomedical sector. I really would like to see this kind of transformation happen in my lifetime. I'll be long gone from CGIAR, I'm sure, before it happens. But it is possible. Other sectors have done it. Data has been shared. And I would argue that, and this is where I get provocative and to some extent perhaps disagree with Teklu, that our job as researchers doesn't end at just collecting the data and publishing our own paper. It extends to good stewardship of the data, making that data available for others who come behind us, whether immediately or in 10 years or 30 years from now, to derive value from the data. And that's particularly important when we're grappling with things like climate change, for instance, that may require us going back to data sets from a long time ago. So I think I've well used up my 5 minutes, Martin. I apologize. I've probably gone over. I haven't been keeping track. Let me stop here and see if anybody else wants to add to it.
Can I just say that was great and impassioned, Medha, as always. And I think you highlight something there is that people start to share data when there's a real and pressing problem and need. And I think we've all seen that around the COVID pandemic recently. Real pressing need to share data in a timely manner, and it's been done. Because people have seen the real problem and it's broken down some barriers, shall we say, to share some data as a result. But I like that you kind of reverting back to this kind of moral duty. There is a tension there, though, because data that is accessible to researchers is not necessarily always accessible in an even way. Sitting within the CGIAR, you rely on access to data from around the world to get what you've what you need to do in terms of your research and your development activities.
Martin, can I just jump in really quickly, because you mentioned the moral impetus, and kind of the COVID data set is a very good example. Yes, people were dying in large numbers, and we needed a quick solution, and a lot of that was powered by in silico analysis. That's why we were able to get those vaccines up so quickly. But the situation is not that far off in agriculture. People are dying. People are suffering greatly. And we need that same kind of moral impetus, and we need to recognize that the suffering doesn't end at borders. We can learn a lot across borders, and so somehow the sensitivities around data need to be addressed beyond borders, and that those data can be very useful, beyond a sort of national border. That's not to say I'm not making light of the fact that there are issues involved. There are more dialogue needs to be held to get to that point. But I just want to make that point that I think the moral impetus is there very much in agriculture as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know if anybody else wanted to comment. I was just going to comment on the fact that that's very clear when you have such a big thing like that that comes up, and it may be climate change that encourages people in agriculture and food to share their data much more and to do so across borders. But it is still a concern, Teklu, I know from a lot of Ethiopian researchers, that one of the fears, however justified, might be that if I share my data, I won't get full credit for it. Whether it's the local researcher doesn't get the acknowledgement in the paper. How much of that fear do you think is a real fear, Teklu, versus a legacy or a misconception? Do you want to just comment on that quickly?
I think there are two sides to it. One is maybe about the security of the data, the way the data is going to be used. And second, basically people don't see that the data is going to be useful beyond the objective for which it was generated. And yeah, maybe this is related to a culture, probably. Some people, I mean, they don't want to even show their data, not sharing, but they don't even want to show. Maybe they think, okay, you criticize their data. Maybe they are not confident about the data, and you say, oh, okay, you found this results, but it should be like this or that. And people are not happy to get that kind of comment also. So there are a lot of things. I mean, Meda, what you said can be correct. It would be, yes, in a society which has maybe, let's say, developed, or so to say. That doesn't work everywhere. You need to have maybe a system that is specifically working in certain cultures, certain situations. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Teklu. I'm just wondering at this stage whether we did say to people in the session that they could post questions in the chat section. Melissa, are there any questions that have come up as we've gone along that might be worth us looking at?
Yeah, there's one question which is around the bridge between open and fair. If open data is data that can be reused, do the panelists think that fair, the literal definition, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, rather than the guiding fair principles that are technical, are a helpful framework for operationalizing open? Because if open data is reused, it needs to have been found, accessed, interoperable to the reuser. It's written in the chat if you need to read it as well.
Yeah, so I think actually Teklu kind of talked a little bit to that. Sander, did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, one clear thing here is that fair doesn't mean open. So you can say open means findable, accessible, but fair doesn't mean necessarily open. And I think that creates a sort of, I mean, when I thought about it first, it sounds logical, but if you think about what Meta said, in 30 years, people will be looking for data. And then if we now spend a lot of money collecting some data, but then we put it behind a weird set of rules to get to it, then you will not find it and the data is essentially lost. I think that's where I think the open is a bit broader and more like a governing principle than the fair, which comes from a more technical background. And maybe just thinking about, when I was listening to Teklu and Meta about the examples you gave, and also my example of how we worked with data, I think we all emphasized that you needed people to curate data, to open it up, to get it together, to make it harmonized, so that's a big work, and we're often forgetting about all this stuff, and it's really unclear where that whole thing sits, this whole step of curating. And I think we need to be much more aware that this is a big effort to get, I mean, even to Meta, your example, you have 760 data points across Africa, which sounds a lot, but if you think about it, it's not that much for the whole of Africa. It's a huge continent, and it's almost, so if we want much more data on hunger, on like food crisis, we need a lot more data now, because people are dying now, not in 10 years. So it just needs to become much faster, and all this whole work of curating, of harmonizing, that's a lot of work. And I mean, you hear some examples of how we are trying to do this all, and maybe in this group we are the people who are already aware of it, but that's really requires an effort, and we really need to be much more conscious about it. And then, of course, we can battle about the framework, that whether we call it this or that, but it just requires a lot of people to get into the same room and to start doing it, and do it for the purpose of finding out where hunger hotspots are, where does harvest fail this year, where's the next locust swarm coming. I'm just giving random examples over here in the Netherlands. Where do we have the big nitrogen pollution thing again? So this is all the sort of data that we need to get going and make sure that we can, help the whole agricultural sector to steer better, I would say. I mean, I will just drop to bore everybody out the link to the paper in the chat, that we talked a bit about this role of harmonization and curation and how important this is, and where we also introduce this quality framework, so that you can read later if you don't want to watch Netflix again tonight.
Thank you, Sander. It is interesting that you mentioned that paper, because I did want to highlight that for people. Do please drop the link in, because I think it's one of the kind of key publications in this space that we've had in recent years. The paper Cultivating Fair Principles for Agri-Food Data. We've talked a lot about actually some of the input, what I think, and kind of what a lot of our team works on are the kind of the human side of things, the cultural change, which is often so hard to achieve. Teklu has very eloquently talked about the value of building relationships and trust. As I say, Meta talked a lot about incentives and how culture can be catalyzed maybe by improved capacity building training, but also kind of good governance, very clear policy. So we talked actually surprisingly quite a lot about kind of culture and the kind of top non-technical aspects. But in your paper recently, Sander, you talked about the importance of easily usable infrastructures and vocabularies, specifically in promoting better and more meaningful data sharing. So that really is talking about the nuts and bolts, the technologies, the infrastructure. But you also say in the same paper, I'm kind of paraphrasing you, that the I in FAIR, the interoperability bit, is very hard to achieve. And especially you also say that it's very hard to get funded. And I think I've said something similar in the past in some settings where I've said often it's everybody wants the water, but nobody wants to pay for the plumbing. So, but given that the infrastructure is so important, how do we get there? You say it's best done as a community effort, that we best do it together. So, quick question. We've only now got, I think, less than 15 minutes left, and I do want to do a bit of a wrap up. But I'd be interested to now reflect on, some of those infrastructures and what we think might be needed. So, why is infrastructure and semantics unfunded, at least in the global public good space, or either unfunded or underfunded? And what can practically be done to build a community around infrastructure?
You're asking me now first, Martin, right?
I am asking you first, Sander, and I think that I think Meda probably has some. Certainly, Meda has some thoughts on this as well. But yeah, starting off with you.
Yeah, why it's not funded, I think it's because it's a sort of boring and not the most sexy topic, I think, in this sphere. So people, I think we all understand the relevance of why we need semantics and all this, or interoperability and what this means. And then I think, and the other problem with some of these projects are that they get the high, like, WSGIT level. So then if you get funded doing it, it's really difficult to understand for funders what is actually going on, because it's hard to grab what is happening. So yeah, my perspective in this is that we should really work more from the communities. And I think there are some powerful communities out there. We make in this paper a list of where the different standards are in the different communities, but you also see some gaps between communities, and start to empower them from the ground up. So how, what are the real reusable cases? Like, I think Teklu mentioned one where I was working with the soil data in Ethiopia and trying to get people then to follow this schema. And then you work from the ground up and show that can actually be done. We did the same with crop trial data. And I think if we get this going from these communities, that the communities themselves say, and the people who want to use the data, so people who want to do something with the data, that they start also putting their effort in and not just waiting till it's organized, then I think we can make these things happen more. So yeah, we are doing in this sphere, we are co-organizing with GeoGlam a workshop in mid-November. So it's field trial data and remote sensing to see where these things are meeting, and hopefully make a step there to see, look, if we start doing this, then we can really make a big breakthrough here. But it's a gradual process, I would say. That's maybe my short answer to this question.
Great, thank you. I logically think of Meda now having a perspective on how one builds communities and shared infrastructures. Obviously, you're kind of in a strange situation in the fact that the CGIAR has historically been kind of a bit of a community itself, but it's also an organization. But do you have any takes on that?
Yeah, I do. We've already tackled some part of this problem. Not 100%, but I think we've progressed quite a bit, as I mentioned earlier. What I want to come back to, though, is the semantics. The trying to get. Many projects exist. Many projects have their own data dictionaries. When it comes time to then start to try and aggregate data across these different projects for a particular crop, say for maize, as these authors did for the study I pointed to, it's not that they don't have their own things their own way of calling things. They do, but when it comes to obviously to being able to aggregate that data, those terms don't speak to each other. What does it take for those standards to be built? I think that's one of the issues as well. Funding is a big part of it, and Sander's already addressed that. But the actual, I think it needs to be recognized that if we're all going to say yes, we will conform to standards, funding will help us develop those standards faster. But creating, when we're talking about community standards, Can we envision a world where, we cap the standard for agricultural data? What will that take? I guess it does in the end perhaps boil down to funding, but it also means that we need people to agree to compromise a little bit and to understand that when I call this thing X, it's actually the same thing as Y. It's just phrased a little bit differently. And so the people who are calling it Y will just need to get on board, or we come together and decide to call it A. Whatever that is. But all of that consultation and the development of those standards takes time, unless you throw a vast army at it. Now, this is how the biomedical sector tackled it, recognizing that this was a moral problem in medicine. In 2015 or so, the budget of the National Center for Biotechnology Information near Washington, D.C. was $250 million plus. And most of that was for curators, data curation. Sunder mentioned this, data curation being a real need. What I want to point out is that if they're throwing that much money at it for data that is born digital, because most of that medical data is coming from sequencers and things like that. It was then, it still is. It's largely born digital. You're still needing that kind of curation, money. How can we hope to get where we're getting on our shoestrings? Our funders give us 3-year, packets of money and say, have these enormous asks. It's not sexy. I'm sorry, it's not sexy to talk about standards. And so, you kind of eke out little bits of money here and there to do that. And in 3 years, you're not, you may be 25% of the way that they want to see you be at. The issue is that it takes time, and something like NCBI has been funded now for decades, and it took them a long time to get where they are. I think this needs to be recognized. The time factor, very intricately bound up with the funding factor.
Thank you very much, Meda. It's it's a question of funding. It's a question of making some compromises, which requires consultation, which requires funding, and all at the meantime. We appreciate that to some it's not the most exciting thing to talk about standards and interoperability. So we've got a storytelling challenge that we need to be able to tell a good and compelling story. And on that, thank you to Anne. Have a look in the chat for her comment about the Dutch perspective. Thank you for that, and basically saying that certainly in the Dutch context, a lot of people are either consciously or unconsciously relying on certain key open data sets. New services are only feasible because they're available, and that's the kind of one of the proofs of success of fair and open data of itself. So we need to keep telling stories about how doing this can be can make a difference. So we've only got 5 minutes left, and I do want to spend a little bit of time, just the last minute, saying thank you to everybody. So just as a kind of a closer, recognizing that making data is more shareable has costs. What's one thing for each of the panelists that you think researchers or funders or governments should do now to make a difference? So Teklu, quickly from you.
I think I will start from what has already been said, which is to make data interoperable. And that starts from the collection, from the creation of the data. And for that, we need to have some kind of standard. And that is what we have recognized. And now we are trying to mainstream at least 3 standards. And we hope that once we get those mainstream, we'll have somehow common understanding on what we say about when we do measurements or analysis. Previously, I said we had 20,000 profile data based on some collected based on USDA, some collected on the European system or FAO system, some collected based on Russian system. From wherever school you come, you characterize your soil. And when you try to put those together, it is really like speaking Chinese and English. If we have a standard, I think the other things can be done through training, through capacity building, through policies and so on. But if we make sure that data are standardized, I think we'll have a lot of problems.
Thank you, Teklu. So as we've said before, it's a lot easier to make that data fair from the start, and I think Meda, made that point very early on as well. Sander.
Yeah, I think this is what Matt also said before. Please, not only force projects, whatever, if it's private sector project, public sector project, research, to make it a data management plan, but force them to make the data open at some point. So I'd rather than a data management plan, tell me which 3 data sets every project is making available towards the end. And that would be a fantastic, I think, achievement if every project would just do that, then we would have a lot more data available, and not just a plan that says that we might at some point make data available.
That's great. So yeah, so plan from the start in your data management plan. What are you going to make open? What are you going to make shareable? And in what context? Thank you very much, Sander. Meda, one thing that's going to make a difference.
I completely agree with what Sander and Teklu said. Total backing for that. I will just add from the funder point of view, again, reinforce the fact that, these policies and the grants that are given out need to have teeth, need to, what are the consequences of not making data open and interoperable, open and fair? I mean, I think that's a real hole. And I know that I'm going to be hauled up before a firing squad. It's GIR for saying this, but really, I mean, it's really needed. Without that, we don't get anywhere. So I'm willing to go in front of the firing squad. I'll stop there, Martin.
Thank you very much, Meda. I'll back you up. I'll be there with you. So if you're going to make some policies that say you're going to make data fair and make it open, then make sure you police it so that people actually do it, and to reward people for doing the right thing. Well, thank you all very much. I think we've run out of time. Thank you, Melissa, for fielding the questions. Apologies if we didn't get to anybody's questions. Thank you to all of our panelists, to Sander, to Teklu, to Meda, to our audience, and indeed for the State of Open Data people for making this panel possible. It will be available on a streaming service via YouTube, I believe, after we've finished. I hope that will be available for some people who weren't able to make it today to go away and to look at that. So thank you, and I think we will conclude with that. I don't know whether there's anybody from the State of Open Data people here who want to say any final words.
Well, I'm right here, Martin. Thank you so much to you and the panel, a fantastic chair, and of course, as you know, deep interest in agriculture myself, and the open data for agriculture and nutrition has been an area for us. So really great to hear a lot of the perspectives that have come through. And just to chime in on the Dutch perspective of agriculture in crisis, it's let's just say we're in Africa in the same crisis situation, probably more amplified by other climate change and governance and resource constraints factors, and are still struggling open data space. I think Teklu's comments. You're a very optimistic gentleman, very diplomatic. Teklu, thank you very much for your input and from your perspective, working in the continent. So I think we'll definitely bring this to a close there. Thank you so much for joining us, those of you who joined us on Zoom, and those who will be watching this on YouTube. Please do keep a lookout for more content. Follow d4d.net on Twitter and State of Open Data as well for more updates. This series continues at the top of the hour with a roundtable discussion on open data on corporate ownership. That's coming up next. So thank you, everyone, and have a fantastic day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.